Hashtag the lost colony of Roanoke, ghost of the New World. The wind howls through the twisted pines of the Outer Banks, carrying only the salt of the Atlantic and a silence that has lasted for 4 centuries. Imagine a settlement where children once played and hearths once glowed, now surrendered entirely to the encroaching vine and the shifting sands. There is no sound here but the rhythmic thrum of the tide, a persistent, indifferent heartbeat. This was meant to be the cradle of an empire, the first permanent English seed planted in the primordial soil of North America. Instead, it became the greatest vanishing act in the history of the world. For those who stood on the deck of a wooden ship in the late 16th century, the Atlantic was more than an ocean. It was a wall of water, a terrifying expanse separating the known comforts of European civilization from a dark, unpredictable wilderness. 115 souls vanished into that green maw, leaving behind nothing but a riddle carved into the bark of a tree. This is the story of Roanoke, a tale of high-seas sabotage, geopolitical storms, and a family left behind in a land that refused to be tamed. It is a mystery born of desperation and written in the silence of the woods, a ghost story that continues to haunt the American landscape. To understand the tragedy, we must look back to the moment the dream first took flight, when the horizon seemed to offer not a grave, but a kingdom. Hashtag 1584, the reconnaissance. The grand design began not with a settlement, but with a visionary named Sir Walter Raleigh. A courtier, soldier, and favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, Raleigh held a patent from the Virgin Queen herself, an honorable charge to discover and plant a colony in the newfound land. Raleigh was the enterprise's financier and architect, the man who saw the potential for English power to rival the Spanish gold of the South. He stayed behind in England to navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court while his captains, Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow, set sail in 1584 to scout the coast. This initial reconnaissance was an exercise in pure wonder. Amatus and Barlow spent 6 weeks exploring the coastal regions of what is now North Carolina, describing an Eden of abundance. They found woods of cedar and cypress so sweet they could be smelled before the land was even seen. They marveled at grapes so plentiful they grew upon the very sand of the beaches, overrunning the hills and climbing to the tops of the highest cedars. When they returned to England, they brought back 2 Algonquian men, Manteo and Wanchese, who were intended to be the living bridges between 2 worlds. Yet, even then, the seeds of future conflict were sown. Manteo, of the Croton tribe, became a lifelong friend and ally to the English, fascinated by their technology and culture. Wanchese, however, remained a wary observer, watching the strangers with a growing, cold distrust, recognizing the threat these newcomers posed to his people's way of life. The promise of 1584 quickly curdled into the military tension of the following year. Raleigh dispatched a second expedition of 108 men under the leadership of Ralph Lane. This was no colony of families, but a garrison of soldiers and scientists, including the mathematician and linguist Thomas Harriot. They were sent to find merchantable commodities, silk of grass, iron ore, and the valuable wapé, a white clay the inhabitants used to cure sores and wounds. Harriot and the artist John White meticulously documented the land, but the reality for the soldiers was far from academic. They were soon plagued by a lack of supplies and a deteriorating relationship with the local tribes. Under Chief Wingina, the Algonquian people grew increasingly resentful of the English presence and their demands for food. Tensions erupted into a cycle of paranoia and violence. Ralph Lane, a seasoned soldier, eventually ordered the death of Wingina in a preemptive strike. When Sir Francis Drake arrived at the island in 1586, the starving, embattled garrison abandoned the settlement in a panic. In their haste, they left behind 3 men who were never heard from again, and a small relief party that arrived later left 15 more to hold the fort. Those 15 men would become the first ghosts of Roanoke. Hashtag 1587, the dream of a permanent home. Sir Walter Raleigh refused to let the failure of the military garrison extinguish his ambition. In April 1587, a new kind of expedition departed England. This was not a military detachment, but a community, 115 to 118 men, women, and children. They were planters, seeking a fresh start and a permanent home. They brought with them the tools of civilization, plows, livestock, and the hope of establishing the city of Raleigh. At the head of this group was John White, now appointed governor, an artist whose watercolors had captured the vibrant life of the New World. Their destination was never intended to be Roanoke Island. Raleigh's instructions were for the colonists to stop at Roanoke briefly to consult with the 15-man garrison left behind by Lane, and then proceed north to the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake offered deeper waters and a far more suitable harbor for a permanent city. But the dream of the Chesapeake was sabotaged before the anchors were even dropped. The flotilla's captain, Simon Fernandez, was a man with his own agenda. As a pilot and privateer, Fernandez had little interest in the slow work of colonization. As the ships reached Roanoke in late July, he grew restless. Fernandez claimed that the summer was rapidly ending and that he needed to return to England to pursue Spanish prizes while the weather held. With calculated malice, he refused to take the colonists any further up the coast. Despite John White's fierce protests, the families were forced to disembark on Roanoke Island. They were stranded in a place of bad memories and broken alliances, a land already stained by the blood of Chief Wingina. The arrival was greeted by a grim omen. As the colonists explored the abandoned ruins of the 1585 settlement, they found the sun-bleached skeleton of one of the men left behind. The fort had been razed. The houses were overgrown with melons. It was a silent, skeletal warning that the forest was reclaiming what the English had tried to take. #, the birth of Virginia Dare and a father's departure. Amidst the fear and the labor of rebuilding, a moment of profound significance occurred on August 18, 1587. Eleanor Dare, the daughter of Governor John White and wife of Ananias Dare, gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia, in honor of the land and the Queen. She was the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of hope and a living stake in the continent's future. For a few brief days, the cries of a newborn seemed to drown out the whispering of the woods, and it felt as though the colony might truly take hold. But the peace was shattered within a week. George Howe, one of the colonists' assistants, was ambushed and killed by members of the Secretan tribe while he was out crabbing in the shallow waters. His body was found pierced by 16 arrows, his head beaten to a pulp. The murder reignited the cycle of vengeance. Seeking to protect his people, John White led a retaliatory strike against a village he believed was occupied by the Secretan. In the pre-dawn darkness, they attacked, only to realize with horror that they were firing upon the Croton, their only remaining friends, who had moved into the village to gather the Secretan's abandoned corn. It was a tragic, bloody mistake that scarred relations beyond repair. By late August, the situation was dire. The colony was low on supplies, and the accidental attack on the Croton had left them isolated. The colonists made an earnestly entreated request. They begged John White to return to England to secure more settlers and provisions. It was a heartbreaking decision for the governor. To save the colony, White had to leave behind his daughter, Eleanor, and his infant granddaughter, Virginia. Before he left, he made a pact with the settlers. If they were forced to leave Roanoke, they were to carve the name of their destination into a tree or a post. If they were in distress, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name. On August 27, 1587, White boarded a ship for England, promising to return by the following spring. He could not have known that a geopolitical storm was about to trap him on the other side of the world for 3 long years. #1588, the Armada and the Hapless Star. When John White arrived in England in November 1587, he found a nation in the grip of existential terror. King Philip II of Spain was preparing a massive invasion fleet, the Spanish Armada, to crush England and its Protestant queen. Elizabeth I ordered all English ships to remain in home waters for the defense of the realm. Every vessel, from the grandest galleon to the smallest pinnace, was requisitioned. White appealed to Raleigh and the Queen, but the survival of the English throne took precedence over 100 souls on a distant island. White was desperate. In the spring of 1588, he managed to secure 2 small, unsuitable vessels, the 30-ton Bark Brave and the 25-ton Roe. They were poorly equipped and carried few provisions, but White was determined to reach Roanoke. However, the captain of the Bark Brave, Arthur Facey, was a man more interested in piracy than in a rescue mission. Instead of sailing directly for Virginia, Facey spent weeks hunting for prizes in the Atlantic. On May 6, 1588, the bark Brave was intercepted by two larger French ships from La Rochelle. The ensuing battle was brutal. The bark Brave was looted of every scrap of weapon and provision intended for the colonists. In the chaos of the boarding, Governor White was wounded in the buttock, a painful and humiliating injury that symbolized the failure of the entire voyage. Badly damaged and defeated, the bark Brave was forced to limp back to Biddeford Harbor, and the row soon followed. The relief mission was over before it had even left European waters. Discouraged and trapped by the ongoing war, White wrote that he felt he was born under a hapless star. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in August 1588 brought victory for England, but the maritime conflict with Spain continued to rage, and the requirement for all capable ships to remain in service caused a catastrophic 3-year delay. For 3 winters and 3 summers, the families at Roanoke were left to fend for themselves, with no word from the man who had promised to save them. ### 1590, the empty fortress. It was not until August 1590, the 3rd anniversary of Virginia Dare's birth, that John White finally returned to the Outer Banks. As the ships neared the shore, the crew saw a plume of smoke rising from the island, a flicker of hope that the settlers were still there, perhaps cooking a meal or signaling their arrival. But as the landing party stepped onto the sand, they were met by an eerie, profound silence. The smoke, they discovered, was coming from a forest fire, not a hearth. The settlement was an empty fortress. The houses had been carefully taken down, not burned or destroyed, and the area was enclosed by a high palisade of great trees, built fort-like. It looked like a place that had been evacuated, not sacked. On one of the chief posts at the entrance, White found the word Croton carved in clear, capital letters. On a tree leading toward the shore, he found the letters 0. White searched frantically for the Maltese cross, the secret distress signal they had agreed upon 3 years earlier. He looked at the post, and then at the tree, his heart racing. There was no cross. In White's mind, this meant the colonists had moved voluntarily, likely to Croton Island, the home of Mantio's people, or perhaps 50 miles inland, as they had discussed before his departure. But the rescue was not to be. A fierce storm began to rage, and the ships lost several anchors in the treacherous, shallow waters of the Sounds. The sailors, fearing for their lives and seeing the season growing late, refused to go to Croton Island. They insisted on returning to England or heading to the West Indies for the winter. White, powerless against the will of the crew and the violence of the Atlantic, was forced to leave. He returned to England, never to see his daughter or his granddaughter again. The 115 settlers had vanished into the woods of North Carolina, leaving only a carved name and a haunting silence that would echo through history. ### massacre or assimilation. The final clues. The fate of the lost colony has inspired centuries of speculation, but the clues suggest 2 primary possibilities: massacre or assimilation. The massacre theory suggests that the colonists were eventually overwhelmed by hostile tribes, such as the Secotans, who sought to drive the English from their land. However, White found no signs of a struggle in 1590, no bodies, no burned buildings, and no archaeological evidence of a battle at the fort has ever surfaced. Furthermore, the absence of the Maltese cross strongly suggests that the departure was not a result of an immediate attack. The assimilation theory offers a more nuanced and likely conclusion. In 1709, the explorer John Lawson encountered the Hatteras Indians, who were the descendants of the Croton people. Lawson noted that these Indians claimed to have white ancestors and possessed gray eyes, a trait unknown among other tribes. They spoke of ancestors who could talk in a book, a likely reference to the Bible and the literacy that Thomas Harriot had demonstrated to them years before. This suggests that the colonists, faced with starvation and isolation, simply did what was necessary to survive. They merged with the local populations, their English identities slowly dissolving into the culture of the people who knew how to live off the land. Modern science and archaeology have added new layers to the mystery. Thomas Harriot's reports on the wape and other merchantable commodities show how deeply the English were invested in the land's resources. Most compellingly, a recent examination of John White's original maps revealed hidden patches. Beneath these patches, researchers found a symbol for a fort located 50 miles inland, exactly where the colonists told White they intended to go in 1588. This hidden fort suggests a plan for a secondary, more secure settlement far from the vulnerable coast. It suggests that the colony did not simply disappear. It moved, adapted, and perhaps became the true, hidden beginning of the American story. #outro, The Ghost of Roanoke. The story of Roanoke remains a tragic mystery, a narrative of missed connections and hapless stars. Yet, its legacy is not one of total failure. The lessons learned from the struggle at Roanoke, the ethnographic reports of Thomas Harriot, and the maps of John White paved the way for the eventual success of Jamestown and Plymouth. Roanoke was the experimental ground where England learned the brutal price of empire. It is a reminder that the foundation of a nation is often built upon the bones of those who went first. Today, the names of Virginia Dare and the 115 settlers are written in the annals of history, but their bodies belong to the earth of North Carolina. Whether they perished in a sudden raid or lived out their lives in the long houses of the Croton, they remain the ghosts of the New World. We continue to search for them in the soil and the stories of the coast, looking for a sign that the silence has finally been broken. To journey deeper into the mysteries of our past and explore the hidden corners of history, ensure you are subscribed to this series. The woods of the Outer Banks still hold their secrets, and the ghost of Roanoke is always just out of sight, carved forever into the bark of time.